Imagining Islamicate futures in cyberpunk and beyond. So, traditionally, when people think about cyberpunk, what comes into mind is in terms of setting, it's either in the West or it's in Southeast Asia or the Far East, especially Japan. Especially in the last 10 years, mainly because of the rise of international sci fi as a phenomenon. There's greater exploration of subgenres within sci-fi, which have come out of other parts of the world, or even when it's set in different parts of the world. And so, for today's presentation, I will be focusing on the Islamic world, so not just sci-fi, with respect to the cyberpunk genre, which is coming out from that part of the world, but also even in the West cyberpunk, which is either set in predominantly in the Islamic world or which is inspired from predominantly Islamic cultures. And so, what has happened in the last few years is that, in terms of production, in terms of new things which are coming out, we are seeing an uptick of uh, of sci-fi in general, which is being produced in predominantly Islamic cultures. And this is a question that I've explored as part of the Islam and Sci-Fi project for the last 15 years or so. So first, some background. The Islamic world covers more than 56 countries where Muslims are in majorities, so cultures which are very different from one another, but at the same time which have some sense of commonality between them. So it's a large part of the world which has a rich history of fantasy tradition. So in terms of the 1001 Nights, from the Indian subcontinent, the largest fantasy work of art ever written, more than 100,000 pages in the form of Tilsim Hoshirba, or mind blowing magic in the Urdu language. There's the work of Ibn al Nafis, the 12th century Arab botanist, who some academics argue wrote the first sci fi novel. And so now to the title of the talk, which is a play on George Adler Effinger's classic cyberpunk novel, When Gravity Fails. So it was part of the first wave of cyberpunk. It's set in the 22nd century, where it reverses the relationship between the West and the Muslim world. So where the West is in decline and Muslim powers are ascendant, it has many tropes of the cyberpunk genre in terms of personality modification via computer chips, gender bending, so on and so forth. And so beyond that, I mean, it is not possible to cover uh, everything within a span of 10 years, but there are a few novels and stories which requires a special mention. So in my opinion, here are a few which I've listed. So from G. Willow Wilson's Aleph the Unseen to Greg Egan's Zindagi. One short story that I requires a special mention is Ahmad Saladin Ahmad's short story, which was part of the Cyberworld anthology, which came out not too long ago. So I will describe or talk about a few of these in detail. So Pashazade came out almost 20 years ago. It's set in an alternate 21st century where the Ottoman Empire never fell. So it's set in the city of Alexandria in Ottoman Egypt. The protagonist is Ashraf Al Mansour. He's genetically enhanced and is frequently wired on drugs. So what is interesting is that it gets some of the cultural aspects right, but at the same time gets some of the alt history things wrong. So, for example, given such a big point of divergence, there's still Walmart. There's still people who are using Windows, for example. The novel, which can be considered to be the representative of this subgenre, uh, it's what I think is G. Willow Wilson's Aleph the Unseen. So it's set in an unnamed Middle Eastern city. The protagonist is a gray hat hacker, which basically means that he does not care who he works for as long as it's against the government. The story is around a mysterious ancient book, Alif Yom, which details the myths and legends of the unseen world, the world of the jinn. Um, so, jinn are these creatures made up of smokeless fire in Islamic thought who live in this parallel world, and the novel beautifully weaves the fantastical elements with the technological element, with a very fresh take on the world of on the idea of jinns itself. And then there's Ian McDonald's Dervish House. So it's set in the near future in Istanbul in the aftermath of a bus bombing. But the focus of the bombing is not to kill or harm, but rather to test and experiment an hallucinogenic substance which can crystallize religious visions. And so the idea is to use that to usher a religious awakening in the population. So very interesting subtext going on here. So from there, from the world of novels, we move to the world of Gulf futurism. Uh, that is the Persian Gulf. So it's a term which was coined by Fatma Al-Qadiri and Sophia Al-Maria in 2007, both of whom are uh, Qat- Qataris. And so what they describe is that so it's a way of thinking that which is inspired in terms of aesthetics, in terms of uh, just how one envisions the world, uh, where there are certain common dominant tropes in terms of isolation of individuals via technology, via wealth, reactionary Islam, and corrosive elements of consumerism, even more so than, let's say, what we observe in American consumerism. But additionally, there's erasure of history from memory and surroundings in the form of destruction of their own cultural heritage, where we things that we see in fiction actually come alive in the forms of world building, and let's say most prominently in Dubai, and trying to remake nature itself. And so from there, we move on to the cyberpunk art. Here, I should mention that uh, there are a few projects that I've worked on which may give the impression of my that I'm a major part of this, which is actually not technically correct. All right, so I start with Sheher Tabassum, uh, s- which actually came out a few months ago. So it's an animated Urdu short set in a dystopian future in Pakistan 50 years from now. If you can watch it in YouTube, the aesthetics are very much inspired from Blade Runner and Akira, so you can definitely see that. So it's a dystopian world where freedom and expression have been repressed, and the only way that you can express yourself is by a smile. Some very disturbing subtext that one observes. So I highly recommend watching it. Uh, another work that requires special mention is the work of Pakistani artist Omar Gilani, who's now based in Canada. He combines the urban aesthetic of a predominantly developing Muslim country, in this case Pakistan, with recognizably cyberpunk visuals and aesthetic. And here are a few examples. Very fascinating world building as you can observe here. And then beyond that, so I'll also briefly talk about my work in Silicon Arabic. So traditionally in Islamic cultures, calligraphy was considered to be a higher art form than figurative art because of religious prohibitions. It's mainly done as with Western calligraphy on paper, for example, or ornaments in buildings. So, but this Silicon Arabic, the idea is to actually represent that in the form of computer circuits. So something which is very much inspired from a cyberpunk aesthetic. And so beyond that, so there's this project, another project is Pride, Prejudice, and Robots, which explored the question of Muslims as the quintessential other in Western society, but through the lens of robots as quintessentially other, and how these two meld. But at the same time, also has a question of automation leading to uh, mechanization of spirituality. So here, what we have are Robo Americans as just another ethnic minority going about their business in everyday life, so waiting for a bus or making food, just like any other person would do. But then also doing their other activities. So, for example, here, praying, a Robo Muslim American is praying as part of pillars of faith. And lastly, there are places where the imagined in cyberpunk becomes real or has the potential to be real. So this is a project that I've worked on. So the motivation is that my father who passed away a few years ago, I wanted my daughter to have a way where they can interact with their father who had passed away. So I created the simulation that they can interact with, this computer simulation. And so the idea is to explore the social, psychological, and spiritual consequences of personality emulation. And then how does that impact or ask the questions related to the question of bereavement, and how do we relate to the deceased, and even the question of personality itself, questions which are very of prominence within the cyberpunk genre. So to summarize, so cyberpunk takes many form. When we talk about Islamicate sci-fi, so cyberpunk is now part of a global phenomenon, so not limited to the West or Southeast Asia. Islamicate cyberpunk is a representation of that in terms of, say, literature, novels, in terms of art, even in terms of things which are realized in the real world. Uh, so to end, I'll just say that I'll briefly talk about the Islam and Sci-Fi project, which explores the larger genre of sci-fi from the Muslim world, and also cyber punk in an Islamic setting. Thank you.